how to write them, right? Okay, so when somebody says, what do you teach? Because I'm an 80% teaching appointment, people will ask me, what do you teach? And my first response is, I teach students, because that's really, when it comes right down to it, what we're doing is I'm teaching students. But then the next question is, what do you teach them if you're in plant pathology, if you're in entomology or microbiology? And we're going to look at both course and program objectives. There is a lot of overlap between what your program wants you to teach and what your course is focused on. And it's kind of a continuum of what the university is for, what your professional society says you should be teaching, what your college says you should be teaching in overarching kind of concepts, and then what you are specifically teaching in your course. So this is, there's overlap, and it is a continuum across all of these. But the learning objectives for the talk, I took these from Lesia's talk, and this is what you were expecting to get, so this is what we're doing. We're going to define learning objectives and outcomes and describe their importance for course design and teaching and learning, because we do use all of these to inform how we teach our courses and how we design the courses from the beginning. So we're going to dissect the components of an effective learning objective and learning outcomes. The difference between a learning objective and a learning outcome has to do with the degree of specificity, and you will often see learning objectives and learning outcomes used not quite interchangeably, but very closely. I particularly usually use learning outcome, but again, we'll talk about both. And then we're going to draft improved learning goals and objectives for courses and or programs. And so this will be an active participation, so be prepared. There will be some active participation involved. And so core questions, and I'm going to use microbiology as an example, because microbiology has done some really interesting and hard work over the last 10 years when it comes to not just university, but professional society and science level outcomes. So how did ASM, or the American Society for Microbiology, establish some curricular guidelines? What were the learning goals and student learning outcomes that they then had associated with those guidelines? And then how are we using those goals and curricula to improve courses and curricula? So this idea of goal and outcome and objective, what is in a name? And this is jargony, and I get it. So a learning goal is a statement that's just the general purposes of education. It's very broad. It tends to be that mile-high view of things. It's not the nitty-gritty details. This is where you see things, or would expect terminology like, what is a learning goal for a general plant pathology class? Well, a learning goal would be that students recognize that plants get disease like humans or animals would. That would be a substantial learning goal. One of the learning goals that I have for one of my classes is that students would be able to use the vocabulary of a microbiologist, because I'm not specific into which vocabulary, just that they're comfortable with some of the jargon of microbiology. So objectives are a little bit more detailed. They're a clear statement that describes the learning outcomes for instructions. And so we're getting a little more specific. And then outcomes are statements that describe the essential learning that will be achieved. So one key difference between a learning goal and a learning outcome is that learning outcomes are going to be measurable. There's some way that we can assess whether or not this learning outcome has been met. We typically frame learning outcomes as, upon completion of this course, if this activity, of this curriculum, it depends on what level you're looking at. Upon completion of this, students will be able to, and then you specifically say what you think they'll be able to do. And so just from a graphic perspective, we kind of invert the pyramid here. The goals are very big, overarching, and not very specific, whereas outcomes are narrower, but more specific. Okay. And again, using microbiology as an example, who determines what's the important content and competencies in microbiology? Well, there are national associations, and it isn't just ASM, it's AAAS and others that say what we think all of the biological sciences should have in them. There are faculty that are teaching microbiology. There are employers and clients that are using the services of microbiologists. And all of these stakeholders are going to combine to look at the content or knowledge base that they want students graduating or students completing a given class to have. So this is done in both lecture and lab. They're also going to look at the competencies or skills that students would be able to do. And this is typically what we see in lab. So looking at this and starting at the top, what are these national associations really looking at? And how are they guiding what's happening in microbiology? Well, the first thing, we are fortunate that in 2009, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS, and the National Science Foundation put together a call for a booklet that was called Vision and Change, and it's this call for change in how we teach undergraduate biology education. And this isn't just biology, this is all of the biological sciences. And this idea of appreciating the scientific process is even more important than knowing scientific facts. And I'm going to kind of pause there because that's really at the heart of Vision and Change. It's the process, not the information. Okay, because people are going to encounter claims that of what is scientifically known. If they understand how science generates and assesses information bearing these claims, they will possess the analytical methods and critical thinking skills that are relevant in a wide variety of facts and concepts. And if you think about the world we're living in right now with COVID-19 and vaccine denialism and all of the information and misinformation that is going on, this is even more important now than it was when it was first written. So if we look at this, so Vision and Change is a fairly old, it's over a decade old, but it really demonstrates the challenge of changing how we teach, because there's a lot of people that have been teaching the same way for a long, long time. And I hate to admit this, but biology is really good at throwing a bunch of factoids out there and all of the biological sciences and not emphasizing process. But it also provides the opportunity to use evidence-based practices to improve how we teach. So again, going back to how microbiology did this, one of the first things they looked at was, what did Vision and Change? This was a consortium of professionals that put together what they thought the core concepts, and this was in a learning goals kind of framework, what the core processes they thought were important from a content as well as a competency. So looking at the content, the core concepts of this biological sciences literacy would be to be able to understand evolution, how form follows function or structure function, information flow or genetics, metabolism, and systems biology, and the fact that living systems are interconnected and interacting. And it isn't just microbiology that is using these basic concepts to inform their curricula. It is other biological sciences as well, like general biology, like biochemistry, etc. I feel like I've been talking a long time, so, and I forgot to at the beginning, I'm sorry, I'm a little discombobulated today because I wasn't planning on talking today. But if anybody has anything they would like to share, They feel free to put it in the chat, feel free to speak up, because I don't usually just give a talk and talk at people. So I'm feeling a little uncomfortable with this. So thoughts? Or we're good? All right, there will be opportunities in a few slides here. Okay, I did want to kind of break up the idea of this content with the skills, and the skills are, again, that more along the lines of being able to mathematically or quantitatively reason through problems, being able to apply the process of science, looking at evidence and looking at how observation, experiments, and hypothesis testing work, how modeling works. Oftentimes, one of the conversations I've gotten into in the last 6 months or so talks about, oh, that's not real, it's just a model. But how do models work, right? And how we use models to study complex systems. And then this idea of integration, communication, and collaboration with other disciplines, and that science is a collaborative endeavor. That is part of the nature of science. And then the relationship between science and society. So this is vision and change. And so this is from a goal perspective. This is even above what ASM would do. This is what AAAS would do. Okay, so looking at what American Society for Microbiology did, or ASM's version of this vision and change idea of evolution. And so this is looking at evolution, which was vision and change, through a microbiology lens. And so they wrote several fundamental statements, 27 in fact. This is just the first 5, looking at how evolution and microbiology are fitting together. So the fact that mitochondria and chloroplasts are really stealth prokaryotes, how mutations in gene transfer lead to a variety of lead to a diversity of microorganisms because of both this genetic diversity as well as microenvironment diversity, and so on. So these fundamental statements can be used to build an introductory course like Micro 302 or a general micro course, but they can also serve as an outline for the entire program of study for an undergraduate microbiology degree. They can also be used to inform a graduate level intro micro course, like what are the core concepts that students should be able to understand and apply in a variety of different contexts. And what's the difference between doing this as a course level, a program, an undergraduate program level, or a graduate program level guidance? It really has to do with the amount of application the student would have to do. Like, are they, supposed to know these things, or should they apply them? Should they be able to evaluate one set of variables versus another? And so that's really these fundamental statements, or this goal level information, can be used to inform learning objectives and learning outcomes at a variety of different areas. And so that's what ASM did. So with this in mind, what I would like to do, I have a Padlet set up, and this is a Padlet is a basically an open bulletin board, and it lets you pin your information. You double click on the cork board, and I'll show you what that looks like. I'm going to pull this off here in a second. But the Padlet here lets you put your ideas up, and you can either scan the QR code, you can type this in, and I'm going to pull this off and copy paste the website into the chat so you can go directly there. But what I would like from the audience, or from the group, is if you were to write a course or program goal and label it as course goal or program goal for either plant pathology or entomology, or if you want to do go for it, but micro's got a pretty good set of stuff from ASM already. But what would that be? So what are you thinking it would be your most important course goals for one of these courses? And goals, typically, there's usually, for a particular course, there's usually about 2 to 5 course goals. And then learning objectives, you usually will have, you know, upwards towards 10, 12 learning objectives. For each course goal, you'll have a couple of learning objectives or learning outcomes. And I do apologize. I will use the two terms interchangeably. Okay, let me get back to this. And here is the Padlet. And I will copy it into the chat, if I can find the chat. There we go. I see people there. Yay. And to click on to do this, you just double click and it will give you. So, and I'm going to do demo 2, learning outcome. Oh. And so it would just be something like that. Okay, we've got a great mix and I still see people writing. So in about another minute to 2 minutes, I'm going to finish up this and we'll kind of look at some of the goals, because the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at learning objectives as well, or outcomes. Okay, I'm seeing, I don't know if anybody else is in there. The other thing you can do with the Padlet is you can upvote and downvote. I would not upvote, but or would not downvote. I mean, I really like all of them actually, but the upvoting is also a nice thing. And if you guys ever want to use Padlet for any of your classes you're teaching, ask me about it. Padlet's a great way to get people to talk about things. And if you're brave, you can do it anonymously. If you're worried that the students are going to take liberties, you don't have to do it anonymously. So let me get back to where I was. All right, so we were here with a goal for plant pathology or entomology. So the next step, and we have a really wide variety of goals. Oh, wrong thing. The next thing is to build learning outcomes. And remember, I just said that the thing that learning outcomes are different than learning goals are that learning outcomes are measurable. There's 4 parts to a well-written learning outcome. The first thing is to state the condition. That's usually in some sort of a time frame. Then you describe the performance. That's usually a verb. Oftentimes it gives you the idea of the degree of knowledge that they have to have, or whether they have to apply or evaluate. So the performance, and then the criteria would be at what level, and then the measurement of student success. So what ASM did with this, and this is actually, I copied this piece from a paper that ASM wrote in, or that published in 2014, describing, linking their 27 fundamental statements to learning objectives. And again, with annual review of cell developmental biology, they did an education part for their annual review. And they were saying a student learning outcome is a specific statement that describes the knowledge, skills, abilities, or attributes that students are expected to learn upon successful completion of the course or an activity. So you can have learning objectives for your activity, for a particular class, for just about anything. And if you're going to be publishing curricular materials, like if you want to publish an activity you're doing, most places are going to, the first thing they're going to ask is, what are your learning outcomes? They may ask about learning goals. They will definitely ask about learning outcomes. So they have to be fairly precise and state a condition, describe a performance, give the criteria, and then be able to measure that student's success. And one of the pieces of this is this orange part, this verb. Bloom's taxonomy is a framework by which we measure the level or degree to which students understand something. The easiest way, or the most basic way, to say somebody knows something or has studied something is that they remember and are able to recall facts and or basic concepts. And so the verbs here would be things like define or list or state. Okay. The next would be explain. So can you classify? Can you identify in context? Can you recognize, select, or translate? And then apply. Can you use this information that you have learned in new situations? So implement or do a story problem, demonstrate, interpret data, analyze, drawing connections amongst ideas. So comparing and contrasting, distinguishing, doing an experiment, analyzing the experimental data, evaluate, where you judge or select or make a statement, claims, evidence, and reasoning. So you make a statement or a claim, you provide the evidence and the reasoning behind it. And then the last thing is to produce something new or original. Now, you can do all of these at any level of any course, but usually the balance of this tends to be the bottom part of this. The understand, remember, and apply tends to be the introductory courses, and then you kind of edge into the analyze, evaluate, create. And then the more advanced courses and graduate level courses tend to be, you're going to have to remember and understand, you know, if you're going to build a brick house, you have to have bricks. And so the remembering part, you have to have that, but you have to do more, because at a graduate level, you don't want to, you know, have somebody show you the pile of bricks. You want to be able to have that built brick house. So analyze, create, evaluate. And there are some that argue that this pyramid scheme isn't really appropriate, because analyze, evaluate, create should all be on an even level. This is just the figure that I found about 2 minutes before class started, or before seminar started. So converting the fundamental statements, I've picked on fundamental statement 14, which says the growth of microorganisms can be controlled by physical, chemical, mechanical, and biological means. So the lower order, which would be, we'll go back here, the understand, remember, the lower order learning outcomes would be, you know, state, define, compare in terms of outcomes. So this isn't compare and contrast. This is just what is the outcome of sterilization versus pasteurization, or compare ionizing radiation with UV radiation in terms of. So these are all lower level, because we're really boxing students in to a given response. And the example of higher order thinking skills would be predict the growth behavior of microbes based on their growth conditions. If I lower the temperature, if I lower the nutrient count, if I aerate them versus not aerate them, what's going to happen? Given a particular situation, present an argument for the best method of controlling bacterial growth. So this would be our story problem. I have this situation, I need to kill a bunch of bacteria. What would I do? How could I do it? And then given a particular organism, develop an isolation scheme using selective media. In order to do an isolation scheme, students would have to be able to understand how bacteria grow and what conditions favor their growth and don't favor their growth. And so the growth of microorganisms can be controlled in a negative sense, but also in a positive. And so this is all very application based. One advantage to having ASM giving us fundamental statements, and they're not necessarily giving us the learning outcomes, because these are just examples that they were trying to help start the conversation. If you have these 27 fundamental statements, how can you convert those into a measurable learning outcome or set of measurable learning outcomes? But one advantage to having these national recommendations and guidelines is we get consistency in curriculum resources. And there is an online journal, it's a peer-reviewed journal that provides evidence-based teaching resources for undergraduate biology education. They are expanding into physics and chemistry, and one of the things they're looking to do. I'm trying to get them to expand into plant pathology. They already have plant biology, but they don't have, APS has not been working with them, but I'm working on it. But microbiology has a learning framework. You can click on this. This is just a picture, but if you clicked on this from Course Source, you could see all the microbiology articles. But if we look at this is again, the very first one was evolution. How is evolutionary relatedness best reflected in phylogenetic trees? And if I wanted to write an article about how we analyze phylogenetic trees, how you do metagenomics, I could contribute an article in this area, because I can see that there isn't an article for undergraduate levels done yet. And then there's sample learning objectives that I could either use theirs or build my own. And so if we look at humans impacting the environment and how that influences microorganisms, antibiotic resistance and epidemiology both go under that category. And then they have sample learning objectives for all of this. So it really does help when we're building a curriculum to share across different universities and colleges and educational contexts the ability to have this framework in place. And as I said, we plant biology and a couple of botany type resources already exist on CourseSource. I am talking with Aaron Vinson, who is one of the CourseSource editors, to try to push APS or plant pathology in this group as well. And they were actually quite happy with it. So let's go back to the Padlet. If you were to write a student learning outcome or SLO for your introductory plant path or entomology course goal you just did, what would it be? And it doesn't have to, you can add add an SLO to somebody else's course goal. You can add a new course goal and an SLO. It's kind of going to be a free for all. It's the same Padlet I just showed, and I'm going to shut down my screen here so we can see how the information is going to pop up as people are working at it. And if you're wondering what verbs to use, if you have to do a measurable outcome, one of the things I added was Bloom's verbs. So what the definition, and this is Bloom's taxonomy, knowledge to evaluation. The lower order ones are knowledge comprehension, and the higher order ones are application to evaluation. And there's nothing wrong with a lower order learning objective. It's just you need to realize that it is a lower order learning objective, and you may want to mix a certain percentage of lower order and higher order ones depending. But everybody who's on the Padlet can click on this and see this as well. And I'm going to back that up. All right, and feel free to chat at this point as people are working through and ask questions or give input. I feel like I'm feeling the crickets here.
Nancy, I had one thing that then talking with Selt about the as you go from the big goals, which are kind of a bird's eye view of things, to the objectives, which are more like for my micro class, like they should know you go DNA to RNA to protein, like central dogma, and then back to learning outcomes. One problem that I've had that I wanted help with was for a class that's 200 or 300 people and there's no TAs, it's just me. They're not going to be creating a bunch of stuff that I'm going to be able to assess and address because there's just no time to be able to do it. And so I asked them for some of those large lecture classes where you don't have a chance for a real creative component. That's a large time consuming operation. And they said one of the real gold standards, as we've talked about before, is that, and it's pretty straightforward. For me, it would be from all 4 exams. If I take a subset of 5 or 7 questions from each of my 4 exams and ask them at the beginning of the semester before we do the material, and then ask those exact same questions at the very end. If they have a gain in doing better on the post and the pre-assessment, that's considered one of the best possible learning outcomes.
It is a really good way to assess learning if you do a pre and a post, because especially if your assessment is aligned with your goals and your outcomes and objectives. And I very rarely use objectives because objectives can be measurable, but the outcomes are measurable. And you know, as scientists, we tend to want to be able to measure things. And if you're teaching and the students come in and they don't know a thing and they leave and they do know a thing, now you have measured their student learning. And it's a really effective way to do it. You nailed it for that. From having the students create something, it is really hard in a very large class. One way I've gotten around it over the years is to have groups of students do a thing. So now I've cut down on 300 students, and now I may have 30 or maybe even 60 somethings to grade. And then I also keep everything very small. If I have to grade something, I make sure that the assignment is relatively small, because I've made, some rookie mistakes over the years. Please, everybody, write a 2-page paper. Well, if you tell freshmen to write a 2-page paper, they might give you 5 pages. And if there's 200 of them, you're going to be doing that for a very long time. So from a grading perspective. Okay. And so concept is understand, replication. So looking at these, I like the level of detail people are giving. So they understand research is never done, can always be challenged and revised. And I'm not going to point out any of them particularly, but just the level of detail I've noticed since I've switched the rules from goal to outcome. We're getting more use of the Bloom's verbs, and also just this idea of understanding how the goals inform the specifics of the outcomes, and the objectives is kind of in between there. But the outcomes are really the important, because we want to be able to measure that students have learned something. And I mean, this comes down to if you're writing a grant and you have some sort of an education thing as your broader impacts, if you can demonstrate that students have learned something or your stakeholders have learned something, you need to, in order to really cleanly demonstrate that, you need to have a learning outcome, like upon completion of this outreach activity, the participants will be able to, and then fill in what you think they should be able to do, and then measure did they do it? That's the assessment piece. And today's talk really isn't about assessment, but that's kind of the next natural thing that we would need to talk about in order to evaluate courses, evaluate programs, evaluate all of this. And even from a national level, we actually, from ASM, we have a concept inventory for microbiology that is designed around those 27 fundamental statements, that we can have everybody across the country use the same measurement to measure student learning in these 27 basic concepts. So any other thoughts?
So Nancy, I have a question. So would those assessments be done by the course instructor within the course, so like in exams or, and is it different from like learning outcomes that are done at the college level, like all students going through the College of Ag have these learning outcomes that are not assessed within the course? It's more of a,
it's to answer your either or question, yes, but it's a bit of both. From an assessment perspective, you can use a concept inventory, and it doesn't have to be the microbiology concept inventory, but a concept inventory in general is basically inventorying students' understanding of concepts you think they should know. And that's really what a concept inventory is. And you can use it before and after a short activity. If it's a really small concept inventory, there is a concept inventory about the lac operon. So before you teach about the lac operon, you give this and you see what the students do, and you teach about it, and then you give it afterwards. And this isn't to determine the students' grades. This is just for us to determine, are the students learning what we think they should be learning? And if they aren't, then are we teaching the way we should be teaching, or do we need to change the prereqs to the course, or do we need to change what we're leading up to, or do we need to change the activities in the course, or do we need to warn the students that this is something that is a sticking point, so they should focus on this? And so having established learning objectives and learning outcomes that are the learning outcomes being measurable, and then being able to measure those really does inform us what we're doing well and what we still need work on. And so I'm looking at this, and these Padlets are downloadable. And if we are going to be talking about this from a student learning outcome or course goal or curricular goal perspective, this would be a good starting point. I'm not saying that this is the be all, do all, end all, but it's a good starting point of, what's the first thing you think about as to what students really should know in entomology, in microbiology, in plant pathology. And I mean, we're getting a really interesting mix of things, and there's quite a bit of overlap, but there's also quite a bit of diversity as well, just like biology, unity and diversity. All right, I'm running short on time, so let me pull the next. Let's see. So one of the things that Leslie, I'm sure, would have been talking about is this idea of course design, and we call it backwards design. And I always put that in bunny quotes because in my mind, it isn't backwards. This is the way it should be. The reason the people who came up with this coined it backwards design is because for years, when somebody said they were going to teach a class, what they taught was the book. Here's the content. Let me do all of the activities, then I'll write an assessment. And then if somebody really asks me, I might put it together a course goal or an objective. And so that was for a long time, that was what, that's how I was taught. I don't know about everybody else, but the courses I took, people would just lecture the book, and then, it would be very much the content would be book driven. And so what this is saying is, forget about the book, forget about the content. Let's look first at what is it you really want your students to achieve. So the first step is to establish your goals and your learning outcomes based on your stakeholder data. And your stakeholders can be people that are employing our students. They can be fellow faculty. They can be your national organization. There's a lot of stakeholder data out there. Establish measurable learning outcomes, and they should be of varied levels. So the know and understand are the lower level, the apply, evaluate, create, synthesize are kind of the higher level. And then how would you determine if students have mastered these? So you go from learning outcomes to assessment. And you should have a formative assessment process where these are very low stakes. You're giving students feedback about their learning. Things like clicker questions for very low points, where you give them a multiple choice or a short answer question and you walk through things like case studies, other low stakes, no stakes, where you have feedback along the process. And then you also have summative assessments where this is the higher stakes. This is the unit exam or the final exam or a midterm, where you're really assessing whether or not students are learning your stuff. And then what learning experiences. So now what are they supposed to learn? How are they going to demonstrate that they've learned it? And what can I build, or as instructors, what can we build the learning experiences to help them achieve these goals? So, we have to ask, is this going to be an online class? Is it going to be face-to-face? Is it going to be asynchronous, asynchronous? Is it going to be hybrid? Are we going to do active learning? Are we going to do homework based? Is it going to be in class? All of these variables really go into this learning experience piece. So we need to look at those as well. So we start with the what and the why, and then address how to teach. Okay. And the other thing I really want to talk about is really strong course design is a matter of equity and inclusion. We are always going to have students of varying backgrounds in all of our courses. if we design courses based on measurable student outcomes, we can provide transparency. The students know what it is they're expected to know because we're sharing those student outcomes with them. We can have valid measurements that we can use to identify strengths and weaknesses in different teaching approaches. If all I'm doing is lecturing and the students cannot then apply things, then maybe I need to rethink all my lectures. We can use evidence-based changes in curriculum, because if we have this pre-post test data and we see that things are not going well or that they are going well, then we can use that to inform changes. And this idea of multiple means of engagement, so you're not just doing the same thing, lecturing, or you're not just doing case studies all the time, or you're not just doing whatever it is, the one thing you're doing. You're engaging in different ways with different, different abilities needed. You also have multiple means of assessment. You have formative assessments, you have summative assessments. You can have assessments that are very short and to the point throughout courses. You can have assessments that you pre-program feedback. It provides more opportunities for a greater diversity of students to show their skills off, right? And this is all about continuous improvement. So what do we need students to know, understand, be able to do? How do we teach effectively to ensure all students are learning? And how do we know? That's the assessment piece. And what do we do when students are not reaching that mastery before we expect them to? It's not that they're never going to reach it. It's that they're not reaching it in the time frame that we're expecting them to. And so this is the continuous cycle of student learning. It's a continuous improvement cycle. And I think I'm just about out of time. So I want to look at any questions people have. And like I said, I feel like I've been talking too much, but I'm going to stop the share so I can see people and see if anybody has questions, and I can actually read the chat then. Okay.
Do students have to read all these?
Have to read all what?
Well, when you write all your learning objectives, my experience is students read the first one and their eyes gloss over and they don't read the rest, right? And so we're supposed to provide these ahead of time. How meaningful is it for our analysis of our teaching versus our students' ability to read these?
A little bit of both. There was actually a paper a couple of years ago that talked about how students use learning objectives. And if you write your learning objectives in such a way that aligns with their tests, students tend to use them more often. So I said I was going to stop screen sharing, but I think I'm going to screen share again. Let me open up. This is my general bio class. And let's see. So the first thing I they have a pretest. This is actually how I'm going to be measuring what they're learning, and it's designed around the course outcomes and course goals. And then the thing I do in class is I give them their learning outcomes for the week, and then I have them designed they have reading guides that are also their study guides. And because students kind of get overwhelmed with a study guide that has a bunch of vocab, which it does, and it's blank and it's scary, I also provide them with a Google Doc that has this linked. And so each of my 200 students is contributing a bit to this. And this is, they just group crowdsourced the info. And so they've got their learning outcomes. This is part of their learning activities. This is part of the in-class. And then this is their formative assessments. And then the Quizlets that I build for them are also their formative assessments. So this is kind of, there are lots of ways to kind of close that continuous improvement loop, but this is the way I do it. Here's their learning outcomes. here's the course material, and here's their formative assessments. And then their summative assessment is the exam, and that's posted at the bottom of the module. And so they can see that the exam is right here. But they don't get to see what the exam is before exam day. I'm not that nice. I don't know. That is one way to do it. All right. Other questions, comments? I think it is important to really teach with intention. So we have, you know, what is it we want the students to learn, and how are they going to demonstrate that to us? And
Any questions for Nancy? Final comments? There's a comment from Beth saying she has her students conduct an activity with the goals and outcomes.
Mhm.
Beth is still on if she wants to share that.
Sure, I'm still here. So the activity is called the Objectives and Me. But really it's more sort of looking at the course goals and outcomes, and describing how each one will help them grow as a learner. And then the other part of that is I want them to tell me their overall goal at Iowa State, how they know that they might have achieved that in the end, which obviously it's like I'm majoring in this and such, and you know, I'll get a job. But then also the course itself. So what are their goals in the course aside from I want an A? Why are you here? Like, why did you sign up for this class?
Cool.
I was going to say, I agree. I think that's really important for them to look at that as well.
Yeah, it makes them feel more connected with the course and gives them purpose.
Mhm.
Great. We're 6 minutes past 4, so I'm going to officially end seminar. But if anybody wants to hang out a little bit more, and Nancy has a few extra minutes to brainstorm with her or chat with her, I can stay on for another 5 minutes or so, and then I have to switch gears. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thanks, Nancy.
You're welcome.
I wish I would have known this when I was starting school instead of now.
I wish I would have known this when I was taking classes and stuff. Some of this is because I took education classes as an or as a graduate student, but some of it is well after. So
Yeah, I find this backwards design really helps with not having too much information. We all tend to overload our courses with content, and you feel like I need to squeeze in all this information. And then when you really look at what you want the students to be able to do, you realize that, wait, I don't need all this. What they really need is some practice applying these concepts. And so, you know, you get away from what I experienced too, which was like you have a textbook and you just read it and you try and learn everything on there rather than what can I do with this information, right? I mean, I didn't have a lot of applied stuff except if there were labs. So yeah, really, there's too much information out there these days. I mean, we can't keep up all the new
Well, I wonder if
generation.
we should stop calling it backwards because it's really forwards.
yeah, I take exception to the backwards, but the person who I actually was going to grab off my shelf, I do have a book that's called Backwards Design, or it's called Learning by Design, and then the subtitle is Backwards Design. The person who came up with it, that's what they called it, and I'm like,
Yeah.
it's unfortunately named.
Well, then I'm just thinking the way students might, when they hear it backwards, the students are going to think it's backwards, or the media will think it's backwards, or, you know, school boards will think it's backwards, you know, now we know now that there's this the little part of politics and impressions basically built into all this.
Yeah,
And if you just have to be careful how we call things.
yeah,
Oh, I agree. But if you wanted to look up how to do this, you'd have to know the keywords backwards design, because
yeah,
that's what that's what it's called.
yeah.
And I mean, I wish they changed it, but they haven't.
Yeah, I like to, when I did some courses of CELT, that they said, design with the end in mind, which is, at least is avoid the backwards concept, but you're designing from the beginning with the end in mind, and then you,
Mhm.
It makes sense.
yeah.
Well, I've got to go solve my own backwards problem today.
Well,
Yeah, I'm gonna go off and teach
I
them.
just had another meeting before this seminar, and then more stuff came in during it. So
I thought I had my quiz for tomorrow written and ready to go, and I cannot find it.
Oh,
So
no.
oh, then I'll leave you to it.
yeah, I'm like, that's the, oh, I guess I'll be writing a quiz now. So
Ah,
it's all good.
yeah. Well, good luck
Anyway,
with that, Nancy, and thanks so much again for your time. We'll,
I do apologize. It seemed to me it was very discombobulated and I talked too
Oh,
much. But
that's one thing I wanted to say, Nancy.
what?
You should never apologize for anything. You're actually going out there up front of everybody, and they're doing us a favor. So never apologize, especially this department.
This is not up to my standards. It was
I know, but
much
that's what
more-
they
more,
tell us from the very beginning when we're giving talks. You never started.
never
talking.
apologize. Yeah, right.
Yeah, I
And,
know.
and it was clear that you had literally just a few hours to put this together while you're also trying to teach. Plus, we'll hear from you again with your tenure seminar, and
Plus,
Oh,
you
well-
just got a cool award. So you just said, I got a cool award. I'm great.
I know, right?
This is what you guys have to
Really?
know.
Yeah, I'm like, I got the award for microbiology. I could not get a higher award for
right.
microbiology
It's
teaching.
amazing.
So
Great.
anyway,
You should be very, very proud. Anyway, thanks again.
Anyway.
We will see you again soon.
yeah, no,
Okay.
it's actually a good lead-in for what I'm going to do for tenure stuff, and I will
Yep.
get you a title. I'm sorry, I will get
Yes,
you a title.
actually,
But
you might
don't
see,
apologize at that seminar.
Well, I
right.
won't apologize at that one anyway.
Actually, that's something I always pick up on when people start seminars, and only women do that.
yes,
No,
it's a
that's
very,
not true, actually. A lot of women do that.
a majority,
Not
yeah.
as many as men, but I've seen men do it too. But somewhere, some way back in the past, somebody said that during a course or seminar series, that not to apologize, because it just gives a bad, then you're making up for it as you go. And you got good stuff, so just go with it.
Yeah, but in 4 hours, I don't know that I got good stuff. Anyway,
You just
I'll
have
talk
to
to you
But
later.
this is what I tell my students. So you are the expert in what you're the world expert in what you do. And so no one else knows that.
Yeah, I get
So
that.
just go with it.
And again, in 4 hours, I'm not the expert. Anyway, talk to you later.
talk to you later. Bye, Nancy.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.